October in Duluth, off the lake. Gray-green and serious. The kind of cold that has stopped pretending it isn't what it is. Cora Lindvist had been 40 minutes on the lake walk when Sable left the path without being told and went directly toward a bench near the rose garden. An elderly woman sat there with a tin box open on her lap and a letter in her hands, crying in the way people cry when the holding has finally exceeded the capacity. Sable sat down beside her without ceremony. The woman put her hand on the dog. Cora sat down on the bench. Before a word was spoken, she understood she was in the presence of something that had been waiting a very long time for this particular morning. Stay with me through this one. If you haven't found this channel yet, subscribe. This is exactly what it's here for. Cora Lindvist had been an intelligence analyst with the Marine Corps for 4 years, which meant that her particular training had been in the reading of things, documents, patterns. The gap between what a source said and what the context suggested was true. She was from Duluth, had left at 17 for the Naval Academy prep program and then Quantico, and had come home at 28 after her service with the specific intention of living in a place that had the honest quality of a city that does not try to be anything other than what it is. Duluth in October was the fullest expression of this honesty. Cold, direct, the lake doing whatever it wanted, regardless of any preference on anyone's part. She had come home also because Margaret Calloway had moved back here 2 years ago, and Margaret had been Cora's supervising analyst at Quantico, the most rigorous and generous person she had worked with in 4 years of work. And the presence of Margaret in a city felt like the city had a better reason to be lived in. Margaret had a photograph on her desk at Quantico. Not a photograph of a face, a photograph of a postcard. A postcard with handwriting on it. Cora had asked about it once, early in her time there, the way you ask about things you notice and want to understand. Margaret had said, "My brother." Beirut, 1983. Cora had understood immediately what those 3 words meant and had not asked again. She had looked at the postcard's handwriting whenever she was at Margaret's desk, looked at it the way you look at evidence of a person who is no longer available to be known directly, trying to understand through the artifact what the person was like. The handwriting was deliberate and clear. The handwriting of someone who understood that precision was a form of consideration, that the person receiving your words deserved to be able to read them. Sable had come to her through a program in Minneapolis. She was dark brindle, compact, with the focused alertness of a dog that has decided the world is worth paying full attention to and is paying it. She had one specific behavior that Cora could not explain and had stopped trying to explain. In any room, in any situation, Sable would go to whoever was carrying the most. Not the loudest person, not the most obviously distressed. The person carrying the most. The one whose weight was internal and unannounced and therefore, in Cora's experience, the most serious. Sable had been right about this every time, without exception. On a bench on the Duluth Lake Walk, on the 48th anniversary of the Beirut barracks bombing, she had left the path and gone directly to Agnes Vreeland. Agnes Vreeland had been a librarian for 31 years at the Duluth Public Library, which meant she had spent 3 decades in the specific vocation of connecting people with the things they needed, not the things they asked for necessarily, but the things they needed, which a good librarian understands are often different from each other, and which require a different kind of attention to identify. She had known, by the end of her first decade, every regular patron by what they reached for and what those reaches meant. The teenager who kept coming back to the philosophy section. The older man who read every account of the Second World War he could find. The woman who came in on Thursday afternoons with the specific expression of a person who needed somewhere, quiet, to be sad. She had given them what they needed without making them explain what it was. Because explanation would have required them to know what it was, and often they didn't know. she did. She had never married. Not from lack of opportunity. She had been, at various points in her life, loved carefully and well by people who were serious about it. But because the loves had arrived in wrong seasons, and she had learned, as a librarian learns, to respect the integrity of timing. She lived alone on London Road, in a house she had owned since 1987, with Ptolemy the cat and a garden and a reading chair by the east window, and a third shelf in the hallway closet that held a tin box with dented corners and worn paint, and the particular patina of something handled and returned. Handled and returned. For 40 years. Peter Calloway had come into the library in the summer of 1983. He was 22, newly stationed at the Reserve Center, with 6 weeks before his deployment to Beirut as part of the multinational peacekeeping force. He came in for the newspapers first, then for the history shelves. Then for the specific conversations that began at the history shelves, and moved wherever they moved, which was everywhere, because Peter Calloway was the kind of person for whom everything was connected to everything else, and whose mind, when it was engaged completely. Agnes had been 39. She had been precise about the asymmetry and had not permitted the connection to become something that required them to be dishonest about what it was. What it was a recognition. The specific recognition of two people who understand each other through what they reach for, rather than what they announce. He had shipped out on a September morning, and she had shaken his hand at the library door and said, "Come back and tell me what you read." He had laughed and said he would. The moment Agnes had become alone with the letter, truly alone, without the possibility of sharing it, had not been the day it arrived. It had been in 1987, when Peter's family dispersed from Duluth after his mother died, and Margaret moved to Virginia with her husband. And the last person who had known Peter in a living way was gone. Agnes had stood in the library stacks that afternoon and understood that she was now the only custodian. She had not chosen this. She had simply not been able to put it down, and so she had not. She had stayed open, in the way that libraries stay open, quietly and without announcement, in case someone needed what she was holding. He wrote the letter from Beirut. It arrived on November 3, 1983, 11 days after he was killed on October 23 in the bombing that took 241 American service members in the space of a few seconds on a Sunday morning. Agnes had read the letter at her kitchen table, and had put it in the tin box, and had not taken it out for 11 years. When she finally took it out again, she read it at the kitchen table in the same chair, and the letter was exactly as she remembered it, deliberate and clear, the handwriting of someone who believed the person receiving the words deserved to be able to read them, and she understood that the letter had not changed, and that she had, and that this was the correct order of things. She did not know what to do with it. She was its custodian, not its destination. The letter had been written for her, and it was hers. But 40 years of returning to it had taught her something that libraries had also taught her. Some things are kept in trust, not in possession. And the difference is that trust has an implicit obligation toward eventual transmission. She had not been able to identify the transmission. She had kept the letter in the perfect condition of an archivist who does not know when the researcher will arrive, but intends to be ready. Cora sat down on the bench. She did not say anything immediately, because the situation did not require words yet, and because she had been trained to observe before she spoke. She looked at the letter in Agnes's lap, not intrusively, the visible edge only, and she saw the handwriting. She had looked at Peter Calloway's handwriting on a postcard on a desk at Quantico for 3 years. She knew it the way you know a thing you have returned to without deciding to. The specific legibility of it, the care in each letter. She said, "Can I ask, who wrote that?" Agnes looked at her. The expression on Agnes's face went through several things in the interval of that question: surprise, and then something more careful. The assessment of a librarian deciding whether the person in front of her is the right reader for what she's holding. She said, "A young man named Peter Calloway. He was a Marine. He died in Beirut in 1983. Cora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know his sister." The bench held this. Agnes looked at the lake. The lake was doing nothing accommodating. It was gray and enormous and completely indifferent, which was the right quality for the moment, because some moments require a backdrop that does not try to reflect them. She said, to the lake rather than to Cora, "I kept this letter for 40 years. I didn't know where else it belonged." Cora said, "His sister is here, in Duluth. She moved back 2 years ago." Agnes turned and looked at her. "Have you ever known someone who kept a thing, a letter, a photograph, an object, for years without knowing who it was waiting for? If that person is still here, tell them today. If they're not, tell me about them in the comments. They deserve to be remembered." She had kept it in the hallway closet on the 3rd shelf in the tin box, with the dented corners, and she had taken it out twice a year to confirm. It was still legible, and she had read it every October 23rd, because that was the anniversary and she did not intend to let October 23rd pass without the active witness that the day required. She had done this for 40 years. She had told no one. There was no one to tell who would have understood both the letter and what it meant, and telling someone who only understood one of those two things felt worse than not telling anyone. She said, "Is she well?" There was a pause. The lake moved. Sable was against Agnes's side and did not move. Cora said carefully, because Agnes had asked a direct question, and Agnes was a librarian, and librarians notice when answers are not direct. "She's in treatment. She's fighting. But I think if you wanted her to know, now would be the right time." Agnes looked at the letter. She was quiet for a long time. The lake moved. A gull went over. Cora did not fill the silence, because silence, when a person is deciding something, is not empty. It is the space the decision requires. She had learned this from Margaret, who had taught her that the most important document in any assessment was the one you waited long enough to let the subject produce themselves. Agnes was producing something. Cora waited. Then Agnes stood up, with the specific deliberateness of a woman who has made a decision and is implementing it. She said, "Come in. I'll make tea." If you were on that bench hearing what Cora said, would you have stood up the way Agnes did? Type yes or no below. I read every one. Agnes's house on London Road was the house of a life that had been organized around the principle that things are worth keeping if they are kept correctly. The books on the shelves were arranged by a logic that was not immediately visible, but that Agnes could navigate in the dark, which she had done, when Ptolemy knocked things down in the night, and she had needed to replace them correctly. The garden outside the kitchen window was late-season October. Most things done. The ones that were not done performing their completion in the particular way that plants in late season perform it, with the fullness of something that has done exactly what it was supposed to do and is now finished. The reading chair by the east window had the specific depression of 3 decades of use. She made tea. Cora sat at the kitchen table. Sable sat beside Agnes at the counter with the attentiveness she gave to the person carrying the most, which, in this room, was Agnes, and had been Agnes for a long time. Cora called Margaret from the kitchen while Agnes held the letter. She described the bench, the tin box, the handwriting she had recognized. She heard Margaret go quiet on the phone, in the way that people go quiet when they have been given something they have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. She said, "Her name is Agnes Vreeland. She was a librarian. He met her 6 weeks before Beirut." Margaret said, "He mentioned her in his letters home. He said there was a librarian who read the right things. A silence. Then, he said she was the best reader he'd ever met. Agnes was looking out the kitchen window at the garden when Cora told her what Margaret had said. She stood there for a moment. Then she sat down at the table and set the letter between them and folded her hands over it the way you fold your hands over something when you have been its guardian and you are about to transfer the guardianship. She said, "I should have found her sooner." Cora said, "You found her when you could." The room was quiet. Ptolemy came in from wherever Ptolemy had been and sat on the windowsill in the October light and performed the comprehensive indifference that is the specific gift cats give to human emotion. A reminder that the world contains things that do not require the moment to be anything other than what it is. Cora thought about her father, who had left when she was 9, not violently, quietly, into a different life, the way water moves away from a shore, gradually and then completely. She had spent 22 years trying to understand what kind of person does that, whether there is something in the architecture of certain people that makes departure easier than custody. She had found no satisfying answer. What she had found, in the hallway closet on London Road and the dented tin box checked twice a year for 40 years, was the counter-evidence. A person who had held something with complete care for a recipient she couldn't yet name, who had shown up for the anniversary every year without being required to, who had not put the thing down when putting it down, would have been the easier choice. She had spent 22 years thinking about what her father's departure said about people. She understood, in Agnes's kitchen, that Agnes's tin box was saying something different, and that both things were true, and that the truth you decide to build your life around is the one you choose. Margaret came that afternoon. She drove herself, which was what she did when she could, which was most days now. She was thin and clear-eyed and wore a scarf that Cora had seen her wear at Quantico when it was cold in the building, and she walked into Agnes Vreeland's kitchen with the expression of a woman approaching something she has been moving toward for 40 years without a map. Agnes stood up. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. Two women in their 70s, connected by a young man who had walked into a library in the summer of 1983 and had read the right things. Agnes picked up the letter and held it out. She said, "I kept this for 40 years. I didn't know where else it belonged. I think it belongs with you now." Margaret took the letter. She held it with both hands. She read it, slowly, the way you read something written by someone whose handwriting you know better than your own. And the kitchen was quiet, except for the lake wind on the window and Sable's breathing, and the sound of someone reading a letter that has been waiting 40 years to arrive. Margaret looked up. She said, "He said, you were the best reader he'd ever met." Agnes said, "He was the best thing I ever kept." The room held that. Cora did not move. Sable went from Agnes's side to Margaret's and sat there, which was the correct assessment of where the weight had shifted. The letter had been waiting 40 years to arrive. Agnes and Margaret had tea that afternoon, and again the following Saturday, and again after that. And the Saturdays became the kind of appointment that neither of them needed to confirm, because the confirmation was implicit in the making of it. They talked about Peter the way that people talk about someone when both speakers knew him, with the specific details that only accumulate through proximity, the things Peter had said and the things he had meant, and the way he laughed at the end of a sentence before the sentence was finished, because he already knew where it was going. Margaret had letters he had sent home from Beirut. Agnes had the one he sent to her. Together they had a more complete version of him than either had alone. Margaret was in treatment, and the treatment was working, and there were good weeks and difficult weeks, and Agnes showed up for both because she was a librarian, and a librarian shows up regardless of whether the day is convenient. She brought Ptolemy once, which was a questionable decision that turned out to be the right one. Agnes went into the library on a Tuesday in November. Not the one she had worked in, that library had been renovated, but the new branch on Superior Street. And she sat in the reading room for 2 hours. She did not read. She watched a teenager at the table near the window working through something that was clearly difficult, and that he was staying with anyway. And she watched a woman in her 60s in the biography section running her finger along the spines the way people run their fingers along spines when they are not looking for a specific title, but are letting the titles find them. And she thought, this is still the same room. Different walls, same room. She had spent 31 years making this possible for other people. It was sufficient to sit inside it and be grateful. Cora came by on Wednesdays. Not every Wednesday, but most of them. Agnes had started making an extra cup when she heard the knock, which meant she had started expecting the knock, which meant something had changed from the bench on the lake walk, where an elderly woman had been alone with a letter and a tin box and 40 years. Sable slept on the rug by the reading chair in the strip of morning light that came through the east window, and Ptolemy watched Sable from the windowsill with the comprehensive wariness of a cat who does not understand dogs but has decided to tolerate this one. And the October light moved toward November light, and the lake stayed gray and serious outside and inside the house on London Road. It was warm. There are things that people keep for years without knowing who they are keeping them for. Letters in tin boxes, memories held in careful custody, the specific weight of a grief that has no one else to share it with. The keeping is not passive. It is the most active form of faith available to a person who does not yet know where the thing belongs. The faith that if you hold it correctly and long enough, the right hands will arrive. Agnes Vreeland held a letter for 40 years with the care of an archivist and the faith of a reader who understood that the best things always find their way to the person who most needs them. She simply stayed a good custodian until the morning arrived. This story is for every person who has kept something for someone who couldn't receive it yet, and for everyone who is recognized, in a piece of handwriting, or a face, or a name, the evidence that the world is smaller and more connected than the size of the loss inside it makes it feel. Is there something you've been keeping? A letter, a memory, a thing that belongs with someone and hasn't arrived there yet? Tell me about it in the comments, or tell me about the person it was kept for. Let's fill this section with the names of people who were worth the keeping. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe, so you're here for the next one. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.